On the 12th of March 1966, Huzur introduced the short-term dedication project known as the Waqf-e Arzi.
The purpose of this project is to promote the learning and teaching of the Holy Quran, as well as imparting a religious knowledge to local members. At their own expense, under Waqf-e Arzi, thousands of Ahmadis are teaching the Holy Quran to the members of the community, exhorting them to do good deeds and shun evil. The net result of this activity is that members of the Ahmadi Muslim community are receiving religious education and moral training.
A famous revelation of the promised Messiah is, "Kings will seek blessings from thy garments." This prophecy was first fulfilled during the time of the Third Khilafat in the person of Sir Singate, who was elected Governor-General of Gambia, West Africa. Mr. Singate, a devout Ahmadi Muslim, was previously president of all the Ahmadiyya branches in Gambia.
Once Singate was elected as head of state of the Gambia, he said fervent prayers, thanked Allah for his elevation. For some time, he continued to pray. Then after his prayers, he made a request. And everybody sees that that was a historic request. And the request was to requested Hadhrat Khalifatul Masih the third that if he could give him a piece of the promised Messiah's garment.
In 1967, Huzur travelled to Europe for the first time after becoming Khalifatul Masih. This journey was beneficial in many aspects and significant according to an earlier glad tiding given by God Almighty. Ominous signs of God's support and succor were observed by all. He visited Germany, Switzerland, Holland, Denmark and England. Whilst in Copenhagen, Huzur inaugurated the Nusrat Jahan Mosque on the 21st of July 1967.
It's a very impressive mosque. I mean, first of all, it is a very good sign that this mosque is built by women, while women are considered, I mean, those who have nothing to say, nothing to do in Islam. So they contributed, I mean, even under very, very hard and difficult circumstances, enough money to build these mosques. And the Copenhagen Mosque, especially the Denmark Mosque in Copenhagen, is a special sign for a modern style of architecture. It is a round mosque with a very interesting, I mean, light contribution. It creates a very, very wonderful atmosphere inside.
Huzur conveyed the message of Islam splendidly in all the countries he visited by holding press conferences and addressing large audiences. He warned the inhabitants of Europe that the only way out of another catastrophe for them was to accept Islam and to turn with true hearts to their Creator. In London, Huzur addressed a large gathering on the 28th of July 1967 at Wandsworth Town Hall. Huzur's topic was a message of peace and a word of warning.
Huzur arrived in England on his first tour after the Khilafat in 1967. The UK Jamaat had arranged a huge dinner party at the Wandsworth Town Hall, and Huzur delivered a speech there, which was later on printed by the name of a word of warning. After this speech, you know, this was a wonderful speech in which he told the Western people that if they would not return to God, they would be destroyed. So the next day and a few days afterward also, this speech was some parts of the speech was reproduced in the newspapers of England and then in the newspapers of the world. So this is it's a small pamphlet, but it's very important because Huzur made some prophecies in it, and he warned the Western nation to return to God.
While in London, he attended the 4th annual convention, known as the Jalsa Salana of the Ahmadiyya community in the United Kingdom. This was the first annual convention of the community in the United Kingdom graced by a Khalifa. Huzur addressed the Jalsa on the 30th of July 1967.
Africa has to play a very important role in the life of man in times to come.
On the 4th of April 1970, Huzur embarked on a 9-week tour of West Africa. He visited Nigeria, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, Liberia, Gambia and Sierra Leone. Large Ahmadiyya communities had flourished in these countries for quite some time. Members had longed to see Huzur in person. At last, their intense desire was fulfilled. African Ahmadi men, women, children and even elderly travelled long distances to see Huzur. They chanted heartwarming religious poems and uplifting slogans in their traditional ways. Huzur's inspiring speeches strengthened their faith. During Huzur's epic travel to this continent, many eminent personalities of African countries had audience with Huzur and attended the receptions given in his honor. They readily acknowledged educational, social as well as spiritual services rendered by the movement. Newspapers, radio and television gave wide coverage to his travels. In a nutshell, this journey was a tremendous success in many respects. In fact, it heralded a new era of preaching in West Africa. At the end of his visit to West Africa, he arrived in London, and in his Friday sermon of the 24th of May 1970 at the Fazl Mosque, gave a brief account of the impressions he had gathered in West Africa. He announced a scheme that he had conceived under divine direction of expanding the activities of the movement in West Africa through the establishment of a substantial number of schools and hospitals, which were a great need for the people of Africa.
And this scheme, he mentioned it as Nusrat Jahan scheme, and he requested the Jamaat to make available for the scheme to be implemented £100,000 sterling, and that that should be done within 3 years if this amount was, because he wanted the scheme to start. And the salient points of the scheme was that that this was to be launched in West African countries.
On the 26th of June 1970, he called upon Ahmadi doctors and teachers to volunteer their services for work in Africa and mentioned that if the number of volunteers did not correspond to the need, he would himself select the teachers and doctors who would be required to proceed to Africa.
When Hadhrat Khalifatul Masih III, rahimahullah ta'ala, wanted to introduce this divine scheme, there were so many hurdles and difficulties in the way, as normally it does happen whenever there is any such divine scheme is to be launched. But because of his dynamic leadership and his continuous humble supplications to Allah the Almighty, all these hurdles and difficulties were removed by the grace of God Almighty. And later on, all the schemes which were introduced under this scheme and institutions that were set up in pursuance of this scheme was most gratifying and proved to be very fruitful.
When Huzur Raziallahu Ta'ala Anhu announced the Nusrat Jahan scheme, lots of doctors, physicians and surgeons volunteered for the scheme. But I suspect that when they volunteered, most of them didn't have any idea of the conditions that they would be going out to work in, moving to parts of rural Africa where there was literally nothing. Small towns and villages, in some cases the clinics didn't have proper buildings. They had very little in the way of medical supplies and medicines, and yet the work that they were able to do to tend to the needs of the local people were, considering the conditions, almost miraculous. And although their aim was to help as many people as possible for free, they were still successful from a financial point of view, such that they were able to build the buildings that they needed, able to equip them with the medical supplies that they needed in order to run their clinics as well as possible.